Earlier, I spoke with Gulnaz Sharafutdinova. She's a senior lecturer at King's Russia Institute at King's College in London. I began by asking her about D-Day and the place history holds in today's international relations.
It's a very good question. I actually had thought today about how history could be reconciling rather than divisive. I think in the last couple of months, we saw a lot of divisions re-emerging. And some people even talked about the beginning of the new Cold War, etc. But the D-Day and the bringing of together of the leaders of the Western powers, and them, they also accepting Putin into their sort of group, even if it's not in G7, but Putin was in Normandy talking to presidents of France and UK and the United States and even Ukraine. It really brought out the power of history, not only to divide, but also to unite. And so there is a hope in that.
What's interesting is I was back in Moscow in the early 90s when relations were really thawing between the United States and Russia. And I'll never forget, I was covering a lot of different stories, but I was there with an elderly gentleman who had fought in World War II. And he said to me, we fought alongside each other. How did we get to this point where with these huge divisions for so long? Why did that happen? And now when you look at it, fast forward, here we are. The divisions are once again re-emerging. And I'm certain if that man's alive today, he's probably asking himself, how did we get here again?
Yeah, on the one hand, it's sort of the feature of emotions. There is always some degree of overshooting of emotions. And after the end of the Cold War, there was such overshooting in terms of the triumphalism and all of a sudden, everyone feeling that they're joining one happy world, all together going ahead somewhere, progressing, into the nice future. But the road itself has been much harder. And I think at least society in Russia has felt or went through lots of traumas, economic, social transformation, while on the side of the United States and on the side of the West, there was more of triumphalism going on. So there has been some divergence, perhaps because of how the 90s and how the transformation went for Russia, at least.
It seemed like the message from this gentleman that I was telling you about is that there's so many commonalities between the people, and yet the leaders are the ones that have their differences. Do you think that the leaders, as they look out at these faces, these sea of veterans from World War II, can actually think about the commonalities in an event like this? Maybe soften their stances towards one another?
Absolutely, and that's why I said that I see hope in history being able to reconcile people, because in the meeting of the leaders that we saw, and in Putin's at least, the quote-unquote the bad guy in the last couple of months, at least in the West's perception, accepting and talking to the new president of Ukraine, there seems to be some softening going on, at least on that level.
Let me get one final thought before you head out of here. U.S. President Barack Obama, in his speech today, said that if we were living in the 24-hour news cycle back then, D-Day, at least initially, would have been seen as a debacle. And I think about the 24-hour news cycle now and how much it's driving the narrative and how these leaders are appealing to their domestic audiences. Do you think it's standing in the way of perhaps a settlement as well?
Thank you for asking that question about media, being the media person yourself. And I do think that media has been playing a very important role in the crisis or in the polarization that we've seen. And I guess I want to especially point out the very heavy propaganda campaign that has been waged on the Russian media that is state-controlled. Media is not perfect in the United States or in the Western countries as well. There is sometimes lack of the depth of coverage, sometimes one-sided vision on things. So that's a very good question to consider, and maybe to advise people to sometimes take a distance to think for themselves and read books and maybe think about history.
Yeah, take a step back. Gulnaz, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much for having me.